Good morning, everybody, and let's start the conversation. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Jenny Rongo. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies here at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, and I'm also the Director of ENCO, and I'm very delighted to be your host this morning. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, ENCO offers 2 webinars per month. Our Emerging Scholars webinars are held on the first Wednesday of the month. Therefore, if you're a graduate student or a recent graduate and would like to present your research, please let us know. We are always looking to provide our ENCO community with learning opportunities. The other webinar features seasoned professionals who are experts in different disciplines and can address different topics, issues, or best practices in the field of social justice, equity, inclusion, and the intersections of race, ethnicity, sovereignty, and other diverse topics. Our next event will be October 20th. This October, we are off schedule, so that should be next week. We shall have the Rehearsals of Life theater troupe from the University of Oregon, facilitating how to manage challenging conversations and dynamics in the classroom. This will be an interactive workshop. Please visit our website, www.anchor.ou.edu, for the list of webinars and workshops coming up this fall. Where are you joining us from? I welcome you to use the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from, introduce yourself, and we get to know each other that way. Our panelists today are Drs. Michael Benitez Jr. and Katia Campbell. Both are from Metropolitan State University of Denver. Dr. Benitez is currently the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He is a scholar, practitioner, and educator in the field of D&I. He is known for his down-to-earth, insightful commentary and critical perspectives on social and cultural issues, ranging from leadership and identity development, intersectionality, race and ethnicity, knowledge production, and critical and inclusive pedagogies practices in higher education. Dr. Benitez has authored book chapters and articles on student identity, hip-hop culture, cultural centers, cultural and ethnic studies, institutional research, and campus climates, and faculty development. He is co-editor of the anthology Crash Course, Reflections on the Film Crash for Critical Dialogues about Race, Power, and Privilege, and has contributed to online magazines, scholarly databases, books, and journals. Benitez has been featured in educational documentaries such as Cracking the Codes, The System of Racial Inequity, and has appeared on talk shows such as Worlds Apart, Hard Knock Radio, and Speak Out with Tim Weiss. His bio is so long, I just cut it. If you want to read his full bio, go to our website, it's on there. Dr. Campbell is a professor of communication studies, and her scholarship and teaching focuses on rhetoric, free speech, cultural representation, popular media, and critical pedagogy. Dr. Campbell is also the Faculty Senate President. Outside of MSU Denver, she consults and facilitates workshops on communication and diversity, media literacy, free speech, public speaking, and dialogue ethics. After completing her doctorate, Dr. Campbell worked as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Communication at University of Colorado, Denver. Her research areas include, but are not limited to, citizenship, civic engagement, cultural diversity within the US cultural context, and emphasis on media studies. She has co-authored 3 publications in the areas of civic engagement and social justice. And her book, Neo-Pragmatism, Communication and the Culture of Creative Democracy, focuses specifically on the malleable conceptions of citizenship and civic responsibility and explicates the possible social ramifications of our modern practice of citizenship. She also has a very, very long bio. Please go to our website and read about Dr. Campbell. So today's topic is the tightrope of freedom of speech and academic freedom in bias reporting, response, and dialogue. You're welcome to put in your questions in the Q&A, in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And just a reminder, we do have ASL available and live captioning available. Please join me in welcoming my brother, Dr. Michael Benitez, and my sister, Dr. Campbell. We have worked with them for a while here at Anchor, and we really, really appreciate their expertise. Welcome.
Dr. Arungu, thank you so much. Gratitude, appreciation for the invitation for Dr. Campbell and I to come and kick it with y'all and share some space around this important and pressing conversation with folks across the nation and perhaps abroad as well. As you know, this is indeed an important topic to all. I'm going to go ahead and put up the slides, but I want to say much peace, welcome. I don't know if Dr. Campbell wants to perhaps introduce herself briefly, or if you prefer to wait until I put up the slides and take it from there.
Yes, I'll take it from there. Go ahead and put up the slides. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
All right, so first, and before we get this popping, I just want to make sure that folks can see this. So if I could get a quick just thumb up from some right on. It's all I needed. I appreciate that. So let me just begin. My name is Dr. Michael Benitez. I'm the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion here at the Metropolitan State University of Denver. Usa Wayu Watyao Di Mike Benitez, son of the land of Borinquen of Afro-Taino and Arawak descent.
Thank you, Michael. Katia Campbell, and professor in communication studies. And as mentioned previously, I'm currently the president of Faculty Senate at MSU Denver, and this is my third year. I'm really excited to be here. My background, I think, was already read, but I will say in terms of where I speak from and my groundedness comes from my racial and ethnic identity, racial being Black, ethnic identity being Creole, and my strong roots in the Louisiana culture, the Creole culture.
Right on. And the third identity, you know, Katia is really, really dope. So with that said, let me go ahead and, you know, read out our land acknowledgement here. This is always so important. As we gather here today, we do honor and we acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories and the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. This is an area that was also the site of trade, hunting, gathering, and healing for many other Native nations that include the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, among many others. We recognize the indigenous peoples as the original stewards of the land, water, and plants, and the animals who call this place home. As the words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties that these nations have to the traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. Let us also acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory by colonizers. We respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. We pay our respect to them and we give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. We also want to recognize the community and families of Auraria displaced by the creation of this campus so that MSU Denver, CCD, and UCD could have a place that we now call a learning community. Real briefly, I just want to go through this. You do, if you would like, you're invited to share your pronouns. Katia and I will leave this up here just for about, you know, a minute or so, no more, so we could get it going. But we invite, you know, any and all participants to temporarily add their pronouns or preferred pronouns to their Zoom display name in the lower left corner of the video box. My preferred pronouns are he, him, his, they, yo, and bro.
and mine, as you see listed, as you're working in the chat with your pronouns, are she, her, hers, and cis. To follow in Michael's footsteps.
So, we definitely just want to start this session by, asking you what brings you here? What do you hope to take away? Why does this session, matter to you? If you could just go ahead and jot that down in the chat, and then Katia and I are just going to open it up for not, very much commentary. So let's, keep it short, but certainly for folks to at least be able to chime in and share why it is that they're present at this session.
And as some of you are putting things in the chat, is there anyone that would be willing to speak out loud to the group to briefly share why you are here, what brought you to this session, or even what you're hoping to get out of this session?
Yeah.
Anyone? And I don't know if I can see hands. I should be able to.
Yeah, you have one hand.
Oh, great. Thank you. All right. So Ranmali, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
No, you said it perfectly. I didn't want to leave you hanging, so I wanted to participate. But I'm here because I find that in our institutions, many of us are trying to do work that pushes back against the traditions of the institutional system of higher ed. And a lot of times we get these responses that are rooted in freedom of speech and in this kind of like broad, not nuanced kind of context. It's kind of like thrown or wielded at us. And so I'm really just looking to help myself better communicate, maybe less from a place of passion and more from a place of or maybe more balance it with having some more thoughtful or strategic things to say in those situations.
Excellent. Thank you, Ranmali. And two things. I want to say that speaking from passion, it's wonderful. And I do not want you to lose that. And we can speak from passion while at the same time being very, meticulous and methodical and constructing cogent arguments. We can do both of those and being reasonable. So passion does not necessarily negate reason. So I wanted to say that. And then the other piece of what you were saying is, I agree about the freedom of speech and how it's used, the principle, or just the, I don't know what we would call it, the very trite, quick response that people often get whenever we are talking about issues of equity or justice. Or representation. Sometimes people will, say freedom of speech, but then it's unfortunate that that has been basically used and it has been cultivated as a way to shut down communication. So here we have freedom of speech shutting down communication. Isn't that ridiculous?
Indeed, I'm appreciating someone, put on the chat. There's, as we move on, there's a variety of reasons. Folks are here because you either serve in this capacity at your respective institution, because this is perhaps a research topic, because you contribute to this work to some degree, again, in your respective institution, either you share or you're part of a bias in hate response team or an education team, or because it's part of your curriculum and this is what you teach, all great reasons to be here, or because you truly care about how to navigate and negotiate these tensions, in particular within the context of higher ed. I appreciate that someone just kind of put it in there, figuring out how to assure that we're not putting freedom of speech or academic freedom as adversarial to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Right? Because these can certainly not only coexist, but they should coexist. And we're going to explore some of the hows throughout this session with respect to implications or considerations for the ways in which these can exist alongside each other, and why actually they need to, and how we do that.
All right. Good. Okay.
So let's move on, just some quick guidelines. For all of you, we're going to welcome to chime in and contribute, but, share only to the degree that you feel, comfortable sharing, and you could determine what that looks like. If possible, keep your camera on so that we can all be in this conversation. Utilize the box function. We're going to be attentive to it, especially for questions. And as you put questions in the chat, we're going to do our best to take those and address them throughout the session and place a little bit of a highlight on those. If you're not speaking, be sure to mute the mic when you're not addressing the audience or speaking. I was saying earlier how I'm still waiting for the "you're on mute" to show up on the Wheel of Fortune popular phrases post 2019. Number 6, if you're on the phone, to mute and unmute, and then raise your hand when to join the conversation when we ask. We're going to be attentive to that.
And then the next slide, just other, oh yeah, you did the first one, so we're on 6. Okay, so setting the guidelines and the flow for our session. We want to remain mindful about who bears and shares the brunt of injustice. Cannot say that often enough, cannot say that firmly enough. We do not share the brunt of injustice equally. And then also respect the mic and use I statements. So we try not to generalize. And even if we are making general statements, recognizing that. But when we speak from our own experiences. So the I statements are helpful. Michael?
Yeah, no, try your best to trust the space and show up with good intention. We truly are here to engage in this, in a productive conversation. Emotions are always welcome. I know a lot of folks, this goes back, to push them back on the sort of conventionalism of academia around objectivity and positivism, and just wanted to welcome that. For many of us, these are very emotionally inducing conversations and topics, exactly because the brunt of injustice is not shared equally with respect to who bears the brunt or not. Try to challenge your best to challenge the ideas. However, let me be clear that what we're not saying not challenge a person, especially in situations when the person is perhaps the one with the power who makes the decisions. And so challenging the idea in many ways is that like challenging a person or the decision-making tied to that power. And then lastly, language and intent matter and impact matters. So we need to be, I hope, I invite us, encourage us to be thoughtful about the ways in which we utilize language for this conversation.
Yes, and to add on to that, people often get the get intent and impact confused, or they conflate the two. And as Michael was saying, it's really important to understand that intent is one thing, but impact is another. And then emotions are welcome. And please do not hesitate to be vulnerable in this space, and Michael and I will be as well. And then also one of the things that's not listed on here, but it's something that we hold dear in terms of dialogic communicative ethics. And that is, and especially in diversity and communication. And that is always expect people are doing the best that they can, or always assume, I'm sorry, not expect, but assume people are doing the best that they can. And this does not mean that we just, take whatever they say, no matter how out of pockets, to say, no matter what, as best intentions. But if we go in with that assumption, it helps us be more grounded in our listening and be more forgiving when people make mistakes, because we all make mistakes or missteps as we are communicating about these issues.
Indeed. And then lastly, we hope that you will understand that we're not going to leave here with all the answers or with all resolve, right? That this is truly a way to engage a conversation that you can see how it can apply to your respective context based on the politics and culture of your respective institutions. So I can't emphasize enough how institution to institutions truly differ in the ways in which we give space for this type of dialogues to happen. I always have a saying, and it's so important that, I may not be able, depending on how I'm situated or anchored with respect to influence, authority, and power in a given space, meaning, meaning that even though I'm going to push and always be outspoken, the institution as a whole may not change or create some change around that outspokenness, right? But it seems today that even the outspokenness is being found with consequences, right? And we have to be able to discern the difference between being outspoken and speaking truth to power in many situations, but also the ways in which institutions at times, or a lot of times, try to silence that outspokenness, right? So again, we're going to be outspoken, and it's up to institutions eventually to determine whether or not that's worthy of change, depending on institutional voices, to include faculty, staff, students, and I will go as far as even community members tied to that institution.
So our next slide here says, think about a time when your first impression of someone was wrong. And the questions are, what were the underlying assumptions you had that were incorrect or misinformed? And then what did you base those assumptions on? And Michael, did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, just go ahead and use the chat function. We're going to open it up a little bit and then start getting into the meat of some of this. This is just a brainstorming activity that gets us going, right? We've done this plenty of times. I know I've done it plenty of times where I meet somebody, or I see somebody, I make an assumption, then I'm like, whoa, I was way off. And then I have to think about what informed that. What was my thinking like? What did I base that assumption on? Because so much of that has to do with the bias that shows up in our respective lives and our interactions with each other.
Yes. And I thought about what we base our assumptions on. Sometimes we can think about our major cultural institutions, and speaking specifically in the United States, but these cultural institutions exist all over. And just briefly to name them, we have family, peers or school, government, religion, and media is a big one. And so when we think about media, especially when we are consuming media, and if we want to enjoy it, we have to be willing to suspend our disbelief. And so as that happens, it makes us a little bit more susceptible to really take in these kinds of stereotypes or misrepresentations of groups of people, because we're already in that mindset of just being entertained instead of critically thinking.
Yeah. To those of you who are, chiming in and putting in on the chat, thank you. Mm-hmm. I'll go ahead, if it's okay, just give an example. And show up in a pedagogy of vulnerability subjectively to speak to how I have engaged in this error. I remember when I was in grad school, there weren't very many people of color in the classroom. In the program, yes, but the classroom was finance. At least that was the finance in higher ed. And I remember there were just two males of color in that class, me and my other homie. And then there was another cat who I looked across, and I was like, okay, this person looks like me. He seems to maybe relate to me. So, I went on a tantrum in the course, assuming that this person that looked like me would think like me, act like me, agree with me. And so I was like, okay, I got somebody that has my back, right? And I go ahead and I share what I have to share around that particular topic. And whoa, next thing you know, this person was on the completely opposite side of my thinking, my acting around these issues with respect to finance and higher ed, and how they impact minoritized communities, and or the ways in which ways in which we account for how we need to address these in higher ed, right? But again, I made that assumption. I was like, oh, okay, this cat seems cool. And at the end, he ended up being cool in a different way and we get along well, but our thinking was so different, right? So that's a moment in which I brought my assumptions and they were, informed by a very particular way of me thinking around how people show up. And that's how I based my assumption. And I was way off. And I learned that day that, in a deeper way, right? That not anyone that looks like me is going to think, act, or agree with me, even if we share same race, ethnicity, and the likes.
Yes. And to piggyback on that, I've had similar experiences as Michael in terms of assuming that certain people will have my back because they are people of color or women, but mostly people of color. And how that has impacted me, especially within academia, is when I do find that some people do not have my back or anyone's back, any other person of color's back, or anyone that they're in it for themselves. I have to admit, it impacts me. It bothers me. I have to sit with that, and it feels. I feel sad about it, actually. And I'm not sure if anyone else has had those kinds of experiences, but maybe I'm just being a little too nostalgic or and not understanding that. Yeah, in the past it seems like people had their back and were unified, had each other's backs and were unified, especially when I'm thinking about the freedom movement and other civil rights kinds of movements, but that's just not the case anymore, and it wasn't the case even then.
Thank you. Now, I've seen that a lot of you are contributing to the chat. Thank you so very much. Would a couple of you like to share about your experience? And if so, please go ahead and raise your hand. You're more welcome to enter the conversation and speak to that experience. And I'm seeing it all down the road, all down the chat, right? I have felt betrayed. This is not a new experience. It happens all the time, right? There is a normalcy in this. That we take for granted that informs how we approach this work. Tiana, please.
Okay. I already put it in the chat, but if you need people to speak up, during a previous in-course session, we were paired up. I think it was in one of Dr. Aubert's sessions, and we were supposed to pair up with someone. And as an African-American female, we were challenged to pair up, as I recall, with someone that, that we weren't necessarily alike with. And so I chose to pair up with a white male, which was a challenge for me because due to my previous experiences and some biases, I had some fear about whether or not I would be safe in being vulnerable with that person. And it turned out to be a very positive experience, but I really had to deal with my fear of being safe and protected in opening up to a white male.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's, it's a perfect example of the ways in which we make assumptions and how those could either, help us lean into a conversation or prevent us to truly show up to a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
If it's okay, then, well, Katia, is there anything you would like to add before the next slide?
One more thing, I think something useful to consider is a quote from a scholar by the name of Habermas. And what he said is, critical rationality is the unflinching examination of our most cherished and comfortable assumptions. And he was writing basically after the Holocaust, after everything was going on in Germany, and was really troubled by how an entire society could rationalize the treatment of not only Jewish people, but people of, non-binary or, various places on the sexuality spectrum. And so really upset about that and concerned about that. And so I think it's important for us to think about critical rationality and for us to be in this habit of challenging our most cherished and comfortable assumptions. It does not mean that we cannot have our comfortable, assumptions or values, but we ought to be in the habit of challenging them and asking where they come from.
That's so real. And, I love, Katia, that you already also brought up the significance as a strategy of our suspension of disbelief. I have to kind of always offer that example to folks and say, wow, what if we couldn't suspend our disbelief? So, right, because the suspension of disbelief, which is a theatrical term, leads to two ways of consuming knowledge, right? In one hand, it allows us to consume stereotypes in a way that we normally wouldn't if we didn't suspend our disbelief, especially to the media. You alluded to that earlier. But on the other hand, it also is a concept that could allow us to lean on what someone else is sharing about their own experiences and subjectivities without us saying, I wonder if they're exaggerating, or maybe you didn't really feel it like that, or maybe that's really on you and they didn't mean it that way, right? And you got to think for yourself. If we don't suspend our disbelief, we will hate film. We'd be like, oh man, that's not possible. Optimus Prime, fell 200, feet from the bridge, and he landed, and Mark Wahlberg was on top of him, and he landed too, but he still got up, not only alive, but still looking pretty as heck, with no scathing on him. And then we would shut that movie off literally in like 2 minutes. We wouldn't be able to take it. We'd be like, this is so fake. Right. So it's a concept that's really useful for us as we engage these conversations.
Yes. And Michael, I want to mark something that you highlighted with suspension of disbelief is that it's not just with media, it's when other people are sharing their stories with us as well. Even though that suspension of disbelief is often tied to media studies, but as Michael said, we need to be in the habit of understanding how we do that as we are engaging with others when they share their stories.
Absolutely. So here's some guiding questions as you think about this session. We're about to get into the meat. What exactly is freedom of speech? And what does it look like in practice? And, can we have freedom of speech while also understanding the lived realities and or hurtful expression on our campuses? And, what by way of free speech might constitute harm, and how do we know when that happens, right? I have to, Katia, at times remind people, especially this became a salient conversation for me around the deportation of undocumented citizens in this nation, that the moment, no matter how nicely you say it, you could say it like this, really, really nicely. And I'm changing my voice because, folks can say things really, really nicely. At least, I learned that in the Northwest around how we can say really nice things or something really hurtful in a nice way. The moment that you start to tell me even nicely that you're okay with my demise, that you're okay if I'm gone tomorrow, right? It puts me in a position where I have to sort of kind of evaluate how close do I want you to my circle if I know that you will literally be okay if I was gone tomorrow.
Yes,
right?
That's powerful.
And then for the participants, this is what we hope you will walk away with today. An understanding of what this content means, freedom of speech, academic freedom, and what are some of the challenges inherent in engaging and facilitating this work in our spaces. Just clearer understanding of the implications for this work, especially when we consider public versus private. There is a huge difference in how this work can happen and what it looks like in the spaces, and that we leave you with some practical strategies, promising practices. I'm not a fan of the word best practices. That's me personally. The critical scholar in me says best for whom and best in what space and what makes sense when we account for dynamics in any given space, the culture and politics of spaces. But we hope that we can provide some strategies for addressing bias reporting, responding to bias, and the ways in which we could engage that dialogue.
Yes, and Michael, there is a question about if you could briefly go further into being okay with my demise and what you mean by that.
Yeah, at times when I hear folks talk and they say, well, you know, uh, if they don't get in here illegally or follow the process, then, they should all not only be deported, but their families should be held accountable and put in detention centers. And, all the hurtful and harmful rhetoric that comes with that. At some point, it's like someone asking you, where are you from 10 million times, right? It's almost like they're really telling you, you don't belong here. You shouldn't be here. You're lucky that you're here. You're fortunate, that you're here in the space. You get the first, where are you from? And you're like, oh, Denver. And then you get the second one because you kind of don't maybe look like or speak like you're from Denver. So then you kind of say, oh, I'm from New York. And then that's not good enough for them. You're like, oh, you cut my Northeast accent, right? And then after that, it becomes, but where are you really from? And now, even though we have families that have been present across the US for generations, what does it mean when you continually question them because they don't have an appearance, or when you don't have a recognition of histories that inform today's practices, and then you engage in these conversations that may be respectful or nice, but at the end, you're kind of really saying, if you or your people or you were gone tomorrow because this is what I think, I wouldn't flinch twice. I wouldn't advocate. I wouldn't serve as an agent for change. And that could be harmful and hurtful. And the moment that happens, right, I have to revisit what that relationship looks like, because why would I want to hang out with someone, not necessarily that doesn't have my back, but at least doesn't care about my humanity?
Yes. So does that help elaborate or explain for anyone? I can't remember who asked, but just making sure. And I think what's important about what Michael highlighted with that not caring about his demise or our demise is how subtle it is, that sometimes people think that, or outsiders or whatever think that if someone is not blatantly saying racist things, if they're not using racial or homophobic or sexist epithets or that kind of thing, then it's okay, or we can deal with that, without really realizing the actual harm in other forms of communication that basically say to people of historically marginalized groups that, you know what, you don't belong here, and I'm okay if you're not here. And that is said in so many ways and communicated both verbally and non-verbally.
Yeah, so here we are, right? Freedom of speech, this democratic idea protected by First Amendment that gives way to the right to express opinions, and has become a very particular area of contention, right? Because there's this word called diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is anchored not only in 70 years of data, literature, research, qualitative, quantitative, from surveys to focus groups, but it's also informed by a very particular history of who gets to chime in. I'm going to refer back to my man and one of my favorite artists, Immortal Technique, where he puts in one of his songs, it's more than racism, it's stay in your place-ism, right? The moment that you challenge the dominant thinking that maintains power, then it becomes an issue. And we're seeing that in higher ed quite a bit from folks who are, sharing experiences or opinions around different critical and important topics and issues.
Yeah. Exactly. And that stay in your place, that stay in your placeism, again, has been communicated in a variety of formats from media, from all of those cultural institutions. And it contributes to internalized colonization, internalized racial or, inferiority, all of those aspects of constantly being told, again, you do not belong and this is your place.
Yeah. So here we are. Right, within this sort of the academy, then freedom of speech takes the form of academic freedom, whereby campus members have the right to express their views. And this could happen in speech, symbolically, and in writing, and even through, electronic communication. So we got to look at the different ways in which this happens. And while, freedom of speech and academic freedom have limits, they don't really make clear what are the boundaries between bias and a hate crime or hate speech. And this is left up to institutions to sort out. And when we look at the data out there, when we look at the way we do this work, we eventually find out that 99% of incidents on campuses are going to end up being bias-related incidents, but they don't quite climb to the level of hate speech or a hate crime under law, right? And that's the navigation and negotiation we need to be attentive to, but that's also, the part of the consideration that we need to be in tune to as we're responding or figuring out what does education and awareness around this topic look like, so that we could carve out spaces for intentional critical conversations, be that within the curriculum or outside the curriculum, while also having in place mechanisms to be able to address through investigative processes those moments or times where language or actions may rise to that level of borderline hate.
Yes.
Katia, please.
All right. So what constitutes freedom of speech and hate speech? And I'm a little, okay, so just looking at the slides here, I was a little, okay. So freedom of speech is, of course, the legal right to express our thoughts and opinions freely without fear of criminal persecution, being in jail, being put in jail, that kind of thing. And also the right to express without censorship or restraint. But here's this though, it's without censorship or restraint from the state powers. That's an important clarification, because private companies do have a right to censor and restrain, because they also have freedom of speech. And that's something that a lot of people get confused. But for instance, if NBC does not want to carry a particular public figure because of their involvement in just aggressive, horrible hate speech, they have every right, NBC, to not carry that person. But what do we hear? Whenever things like that happen, we hear the person impacted saying, oh, my free speech rights, and people don't care about free speech and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is if they learned about the principles and the landmark cases involving freedom of speech, they would realize that private companies do have a right. And just as our institutions that many of us probably work at, they have a right to constrain our speech. And then abusive and threatening speech or writing that expresses, this is hate speech, that expresses prejudice against a particular group, especially on the basis of minoritized, marginalized, and protected identities. And by the way, the definitions of hate speech and abusive speech, I think one of the best primaries or the sources to use is Matsuda et al.'s Words That Wound. And there's a thorough discussion about that. And then just really quickly, we also have Judith Butler, Excitable Speech, and Catherine McKinnon, Only Words. And they talk about the constitutive nature of speech and not just looking at communication as a tool, but as constitutive of our society. So the next slide is, and I'll just read this, civility, openness, and mutual endeavor. And this is about civil disagreement, personal integrity in a pluralistic society. And the quote, the source for this is Ed Landrak. So here, let me read this. Oh, here it is, right here. You can, oh, Michael, do you want to go ahead and take over and read the civil disagreement, the statement on civility? And you're on mute.
This is one of my favorite quotes, and I want to pretext it by offering some insight into the images that I have. Here we are in higher education, where we get students, faculty, and staff each and every year from incredibly, let's say maybe rural or generally homogenous, communities. And I don't want to assume that all rural communities are homogenous. So I want to say that with a very particular care. But largely when you think about the US, that's where you find more of a homogenous culture, right? And they'll come to that space where you exist and where you're learning and where you're teaching and engaging and say, even if there's 4 people of color, they'll say, oh my God, this is like the most diverse place ever, right? And meanwhile, you're sitting there saying, whoa, I don't know about all that. Now, you may have folks who come from either urban communities or other incredibly diverse communities, and they come to that very same space and say, what the hell did I get myself into? This is super white. And the thing about that is that they're both right. From their own angles and experiences. So how do we work through that? Because at the end, we have to do that work every year with a new set of faculty and staff and students who are now joining this shared space and community. So, and quote, Ed Langerak goes on to say, civility is treating others with appropriate courtesy and respect. Much of what civility involves is context relative, and often it is relative mainly to what is needed for a shared task or a mutual endeavor. Then the question of what civility requires in a given context or association is related to the question of what we are trying to accomplish together. Notice that the context may well include people who are strangers and even past opponents. So we really cannot rely on affection, friendship, or familiarity to set boundaries. Civility is something we intentionally bring to the situation. I want to say that piece again. Civility is something we intentionally bring to a situation. That piece is so important. Not necessarily something that flows from natural feelings. Notice also that civility involves patience and restraints. It has much to do with what we will not do to each other as what we will do for each other. And I really dig that quote because it speaks to this agreement where we elected to attend an institution or join an institution, and what role collectively do we have in contributing then to a conversation where we're not showing up with malice, but truly trying to show up both as teachers and learners into a space to better advance this work and improve relationships and cultivate those relationships in the community, which is grounded in quite a bit of bias and thinkings and perspectives that may not see eye to eye. For example, right, when I first went to higher ed, it was the first time when I truly asked myself, what happens when arrogance doesn't speak humility, right? How do you negotiate that?
That's powerful, yes. And one other thing about civility, and Michael and I have talked about this quite frequently, is that we also want to understand as we strive for civility, it's also important to question or at least understand by whose notion or definition of civility are we operating with? Because civility, the concepts, our definition of civility is also tied to culture and is influenced heavily by culture. And so if we are, like we talk about the politics of politeness, for instance. So if we are following this notion, one notion of civility within a meeting space, but that notion is heavily grounded in a particular dominant culture, then the question is it really civil for others participating in that?
There's a great book by Alex Zamalin titled Against Civility, The Hidden Racism in Our Obsession with Civility. I'll put that on the chat here shortly, but it does a really good job in addressing sort of the subtlety in between messaging that happens when we lean on the civility, and we should, but again, addresses under what norm, under what premise, how is it epistemologically grounded, and who can take that on by way of the conversation, but who is it actually hurting by way of not shifting or sharing the way power and resourcing happens in these spaces. Yeah. So let me put it to you, and again, a chat question, and we're gonna just move quickly through some of this content, is how do you personally respond to issues of free speech and bias? And if you could respond on the chat, that would be great.
Great answers. Identify, call it out, educate. Always thinking about who has power. I love the clarifying questions.
Yes, calling it in. That's let me mark that. Loretta Ross, who always speaks to the calling in and the role of radical love in spaces such as these.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, proactive education, intentionality around the ways we integrate this into programming, into the curriculum. Yeah, it depends on your mood. I love that, Tamara. It depends on your mood, indeed.
Absolutely. And Brian, I love how you indicated thinking about responsibility.
Yeah.
It's an important piece.
Or even sitting back, someone just put Katia, right? And really just sitting with it, gathering yourself and figuring out what might a response look like or come across.
Yes. And the core values. These are excellent. Thank you all for responding.
Indeed, indeed. And so now then we ask the question, not to you all, but to ground the next series of slides. How does your institution now, beyond the personal or organization, respond to incidents of bias and hate? Especially when we think about implications, right? When we know that things like bias can lead to a lack of belonging and a higher attrition and lower rates of retention among students of color, but it also leads to attrition among faculty and staff. I've had my share of experiences where the efforts to silence me were so great that I said, perhaps this place is not for me, right, any longer, because at minimum, I should be able and need to be able to be respectfully outspoken, even as institutions wrestle and struggle with negotiating and navigating how to implement change to improve campus climate or workplace spaces. Katia?
Yes, and looking at some of these comments about institutional level actions, I see some of, hey, our institution does this, or we say we're doing this, but then it just kind of goes away, or it fades back. And I think that a lot of us have probably experienced that with our institutions. That's a product of course, embedded systemic oppression and colonialization within our institutions, and also oftentimes the people who do have the power or the decision-making capabilities, not necessarily having the stamina or the will to stick with it because maybe it doesn't apply. They don't feel like it applies to them. And then, of course, we get a lot of emphasis placed on people from historically marginalized groups to put forth that emotional labor, that extra, all of that, and there's burnout. So, yeah, it's a complex.
No, indeed, that's absolutely right. And so we also see that it has higher levels of microaggressions that are correlated with higher levels of depression, anxiety, and some other, mental health, challenges. And, I don't think that we're seeing a growth in, although we've certainly now seen a real growth in. But before the pandemic, we started to talk about mental health as there's a growth in, when the reality is that mental health has always been a present issue. We just weren't addressing it until it started to truly come up to light more. And we have to account for the intersections around identity in particular, which, in turn, leads us to have to create at times silos within higher education so that we could survive, or folks feeling like they could survive instead of thriving. And in turn, it could also create disconnectedness with a larger institution, which has other implications beyond, sort of the self for alumni or recruitment or given. So there's so many things to account for when we think about the value and importance of addressing these issues with intentionality and taking it head on. With that said, when you think about what are some of the implications for reporting and responding, we're thinking about trauma, right? We're thinking about how are people already showing up to our respective campuses with trauma, the backpack of trauma as a result of structural isms, and the dominant racism being among one of them. But that's not to discount religious bigotry or thinkings around superiority, ableism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and the likes. Navigating and negotiating, right? The sort of capitalistic, colonial, dominant cultural spaces that weren't really created with minoritized, marginalized, and protected identities in mind. And these are more likely to happen at historically white institutions. However, I do want to be clear that these also happen at other affinity institutions as well. And then, what are the structural and interpersonal practices that sustain these organizational environments and the disparate impact in particular that these have on minoritized communities? It's like the difference back to the beginning between the history and power, something like the N-word has, because of the violence, because of the atrocities tied to it, versus when somebody says, and I'll say this out loud, more so not as a derogatory term, but because it hasn't really any power or violence behind it, the term hunky, to refer to a white person that doesn't exactly have, if you think the US, 350 years, if you think Latin America, you're now talking almost 530 years of tied lynchings and violence to Black and brown bodies in particular.
Yes. And as Michael was saying, the history behind this, Judith Butler, who wrote Excitable Speech, says that words often carry with them the historicity of force. So when a word is used, it carries with it all the history. And basically, if you are on the receiving end of that heinous word, it's like a slap in terms of all the history. So as Michael indicated, some other words used towards dominant groups, they might not have the same kind of weight because they do not have that historicity of force. And then one other quick thing, Amanda mentioned this isn't who we are, and in terms of a criticism about what we often say. And what I always say is that power operates best through its protective cloak of invisibility. And so if we can pretend everything is great, and if we can downplay the power mechanisms that are going on and relationships that are going on, then my goodness, it's effective.
Indeed, no, absolutely, right. And in that way, then we start to get into this differences in the ways these conversations happen, even geographically, right? When I was in the, it's always interesting, in the Northeast, it's just keep it real. Just go back and forth and then enjoy a beer afterwards, most of the time. In the, Midwest, I have found it to be aggressive, passive aggressive. They aggressively let you know that they're being passive aggressive. In the Northeast, in the Pacific Northwest, it's adverse isms, right? They deal with it by not dealing with it and still showing up nice and ignoring it, generally speaking. And I'm speaking high level, right? Just big culture. And then in the, South is that Southern hospitality, but folks kind of know where they stand and they'll still treat you nice, but also with this sort of like just know your place in a lot of places. And then you look at Cali, which is more like a laid back mixture between passive aggression and adverse-ism.
Yes.
So here we have the definition of a hate crime. We're not going to get into it in terms of reading it, but hate crime, right, has a very particular legal definition that is important to understand beyond just EEO or compliance. A crime which is in whole part is motivated by the offender's bias towards a victim's identity status, as Katia mentioned and highlighted earlier in particular. And so hate crimes are illegal and subject to prosecution, but to actually prove under legal court, a hate crime takes so much concrete so-called evidence, right? Hence why so few cases really reach that level.
Yes. And what I'm putting in the chat right now is the landmark case from the Supreme Court, Brandenburg versus Ohio, which established the incitement standard when it comes to abusive speech. And that made it very difficult it set a high bar, as Michael was saying, to prove that speech should count as hate speech. or
And
abuse.
then something that will constitute that, right? We start to get now into malicious harassment, right? And a person is guilty or responsible of malicious harassment if they maliciously and or intentionally commit one of the following acts, which eventually rises to the hate crime: physical injury, physical damage, or reasonable fear of harm, right? That's like a very straight up, I don't like you as a result of, and therefore this is how I'm going to act. Or, and that may be personal, that may be, to property, or you truly feel threatened. But that eventually are some of the things that rise up the legal ladder by way of that bar that need to be approved under law. But then most of them actually fall into implicit or explicit bias, which really kind of reflect the attitudes and beliefs many endorse at that conscious level, while others do it at the more subconscious or implicit levels. And again, I'm not going to get into the definitions, and the next slides go over this in a bit more of a practical way. But implicit biases are not completely inflexible. They're really malleable to some degree and manifest in different ways. I may be, thinking, for example, about being a Black, brown person in a predominantly white space, but maybe I'm not thinking about being a male in a predominantly male space, right? And how might I advocate one particular aspect of issues while also being the one that inflicts based on certain privileges and powers tied to different aspects of my identity.
Mm-hmm. And just let us know if you have any questions, since we want to make sure that we get through these in enough time. So if you have any questions, just let us know, raise your hand or put it in the chat.
So here we are, what is implicit bias? It describes those attitudes that we have without really knowing that we're engaging in them and without our own conscious knowledge, right? And they fall into different categories. Alien in your own land, I gave an example of that earlier. Ascription of intelligence and or who's smart or intrinsic skills, or folks who say I don't see color, in which, I've learned to carry a deck of business cards with a great optometrist that I know. And when people say they're colorblind, I just say, hey man, you really need to see my eye doctor so they could take care of that. And that we could see, right, appearance and color, and then be able to wrestle and move through that. What races and or bodies are tied to criminality or criminal behavior or unwelcome behavior? Denial of individual prejudice, myth of meritocracy, second-class citizenship, religious or cultural superiority, and environmental microaggressions. Those then turn into microaggressions, right? The implicit bias, those common place daily verbal interactions that we have that lead intentionally or not to creating and cultivating hostility in particular environments. And that could come from questions such as, where are you from? You speak great English. Or, Asian people are just naturally smart. Or women, they're just genetically emotional. That's just who they are. No, not men. No, not us. I will almost venture to some degree otherwise when men don't get their way. Everyone can succeed if they work hard enough. Back to that myth of meritocracy. Hey, I have nothing against gay and lesbian identified people, but I just wouldn't want my child to be taught by someone who identifies as such, right? These are all examples of the ways these show up and collectively eventually create very real impact in our communities. Those then lead to the micro inequities. And you could, talk about micro inequities in three ways: as micro assaults, micro insults, or micro invalidations. Each of them a level tied to the dismissal or the targeting aspects of yourself. So one of them deals with your experiences and your thoughts and what you bring to the table. The other one deals with subjectivities, and the other one deals with the ways in which you're invalidated. Whereas assault deals with, it's just frank out an ism, the ways in which somebody not only disagrees, right, but they come at your neck.
Yes. And as Michael was talking about the microaggressions, microinequities, all of that, it's important to keep in mind that all of these, it might not be something major, one thing that happens, but it's the daily, just the daily microaggressions that just eat away at us and cause stress, cause trauma, cause just dissatisfaction in terms of going into our workplace or being around particular people. And I just do not want, I don't want us to, I don't want us to diminish the importance of the daily microaggressions and inequities that people feel.
Absolutely. And we see here that biases, they don't have to be verbal. They could be commentary, written statements, gestures, drawings, doodling, markings, symbols, graffiti, discrimination, and sexual misconduct could all be different type of biases. Those sexual misconduct, depending on definitions, can also rise to that level of sexual assault.
Yes.
So when we think about bias, this is what constitutes a bias incident. A hate or bias incident is an action in which a person is made aware that his, her, or their status is offensive to another, but that does not necessarily rise to a level of a crime. So what does this mean exactly? How do we approach this when it shows up on our campuses? What does this mean within the context of this, right? Academic freedom, freedom of speech, ability to say what we want. The bias in itself is sort of that personal inclination of temperament based on recent judgment, which is the opposite then of critical rationality, Katia, right? To your point around, what is the other side of that coin? And a bias incident could be something committed against a person or a group. It could be motivated by bias against a perceived or actual identity. Whether it's real or not becomes irrelevant. It's the motivation. It can be an expression of hostility. It may or may not be hate speech. It may or may not be protected speech.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I do remember as we began this session, there were a few questions about understanding more about bias incidents and reporting. So please ask the questions or put them in the chat as they come up. All right. So do you want to take this again? Oh, you already covered this, right? What constitutes a bias incident? Michael?
Yeah, and so now I'm moving to campus community and bias hate, right? It's important to know that we all as campus members have a responsibility to respond quickly and effectively beyond the statement, beyond a campus-wide email when something happens. How are we truly engaging action around it, but still doing so in a way, and this is important, that brings to the table the different sides. The way that I look at this, and I show up primarily as an educator, so I'll let you know what informs me. When I think about these issues, I really think about the ways in which people show up hurt. It's like going to a hospital, you have a wound, right? This is like a mental wound. This is like a mental hurt. And if we don't take a certain responsibility to address these or try to engage conversations to heal and bring some clarity, awareness, and education around these, where else are folks who have this mental wounds gonna go to get this? Like, for example, back in, I think 2010, I contributed to a book by Lori Patton on our cultural spaces, critical cultural spaces, the right spaces for white people, for example, to be involved. And I made an argument that yes, because where else do you send them? Do you send them back to a sorority and fraternity house? Where are they going to have these conversations, and what role and responsibility does a space like cultural centers have, not only in serving as a sanctuary for minoritized and protected identities, but as an educational hub and curricular classroom for dominant identities? And if we don't address these, then we also know, right, that it leads to a rupture in civic trust that we have to deal with, mend and reconcile. We have to think about ensuring, the safety to the best of our ability and well-being of targeted individuals and groups. And we've seen that emerge enormously over the last 6-7 years. and reestablish norms so that we could, really try to deter incidents from happening, but also, thinking about, how we can engage this work in a way where we see reporting, response, and communication as our ability to communicate incidents when they occur on our respective campuses. One, that it creates a greater awareness around these issues and how they exist, and show how incidents of bias and hate may be shaping and informing our community, that we cultivate a space for this proactive dialogue related to some emerging trends. And at times, they're not just emerging trends, they're just existing long trends over times that have been there, and it's part of our role in recultivating what that can look like, and collaborating and collecting, data. This is such an important factor, because if we can identify patterns, or are these things happening in one place more so over others, or is this something that there's particular issues that are taking place that we could create some intentional programming around, then we don't necessarily have to focus on the people. We could take a greater responsibility institutionally to engage both curricular and co-curricular opportunities to address these issues through proactivity.
Yes. I really appreciate, Michael, your analogy about the medical just being diagnosed or interacting in just that analogy when it comes to bias and hate. And also it's good to understand that it's an analogy, but it's figurative and it's literal, because these experiences have literal impact on our health, our mental health, our physical health, our spiritual health, all of that.
Indeed, and I want to respond to the question that just came up real quick, and we have about 5 minutes left, and we're going to open it up. The question is, how do you bring both sides to the table when one side is literally trying to prove that trans people don't exist? Doesn't that do more harm to provide the platform for those views from a tenured faculty member? So, the navigating and negotiating the difficulty of that question is exactly why these conversations are hard, right? On one side, you have someone who for their whole lives has either been dismissive, doesn't believe in, they bring certain perspectives or elements that are informed, whether for the better or worse, by inadequate understandings around the coexistence and multiple existence of humanities and identities, which is so important. On the other hand, you have someone who's truly trying to say, I'm here, this is who I am, this is normal, this is human. And not discounted, but this is where it gets difficult. And I always tell folks who lean, let's say, further maybe conservative, I'm not going to use the terms right and left. I'm going to use conservative. They're going to show up to the space and have a certain opinion. And while it does create a certain level of hurt, right? That's also higher education, and why we are in this space, higher education, which for someone like me who thinks very, kind of liberal minded, could even at times be difficult. Back to the, what if you're really telling me that if tomorrow I don't exist, you'll be fine with it? And how do we still coexist in those spaces? Because our role is not really to change people. People need to change, or hopefully they will change themselves and become more open and just suspend their disbeliefs. But our role is to provide the opportunities for this work and this education to happen in a society that has marginalized, absented, and invisibilized these identities literally for 350 years. And so when you think about then, what are some of the objectives for this work, or having a process in place that is proactive? This is about equipping a community to be able to report incidents of bias and hate and offering the mechanisms to do so. It is also about raising awareness around these patterns and trends. It is around providing support and resources, but it assures institutional accountability and responsiveness, and dismantling obstacles of and to reporting.
Yes.
Katia, please.
Yes, and going back to Mary's question as well, I would love for us to get to a place in our society where we value public rationality and public reason. So that unfortunately we are going up against many of us, at least in the United States, being taught that all opinions matter, and it's been translated into all opinions are equal. And the fact of the matter is that yes, we're all entitled to our opinions, but if we can't support our opinions with evidence, with facts, with cogent arguments, then should they be elevated to that point, to spread? And then also, what can we do as individuals to, especially, in our circles, to not necessarily demand, but to encourage that reason, that public reason and rationality, instead of just saying, okay, yes, that's your opinion, so go ahead and share it, regardless of how it dehumanizes other groups of people.
So when you look at then this combination, right, of data, of education and programming, and then of curricular intention, then we begin to see this emergence of being able to, at a minimum, cultivate a culture of openness with respect to responding to and addressing bias while negotiating the very real politics of what surfaces to a hate crime. And we know that less than 1% of cases reported or experiences reported rise to that level. And then lastly, an opportunity, Katia, I'm going to put her on the spot. She teaches a course here on communication around dialogues. It's really one of the popular courses here. Everybody wants to take it. It gets at teaching how to effectively communicate, especially around this work. So Katia, please tell us a little bit more about that phenomenal work you're doing.
Thank you, Michael. The course is communication ethics, and there is, and several of us teach it in our department, there's a piece of it about dialogic ethics. And we've used that piece to begin our dialogues program here at MSU Denver. And so within the dialogues program, one of the things that we highlight is what you see on the screen in front of you, is as we are engaging with dialogue, regardless of whom it's with, we have to understand that there is a comfort zone, which you see in that green area, where we talk with people. Michael and I can talk, and we can talk with our colleagues, feel good about them supporting us and being in the same kind of, with the same kind of mindset. But then there's that learning edge, which is where conflict occurs. And that's actually where we want to be when we are trying to instigate change and growth. We cannot grow if we stay in that comfort zone. We have to have that feeling of discomfort, and we have to be okay with sitting in that feeling of, just not being as comfortable. However, we don't want to be pushed all the way into the danger zone. And especially if you find yourselves talking with someone and trying to share your thoughts about all of the things that we've discussed today, that if you know that they are in that danger zone and they are not ready to hear what you have to say, they are going to shut down. And so no communication, no interaction, no growth is going to occur. And so the goal again is to, yes, we need our comfort zone to be able to go back and heal and have camaraderie and fellowship and friendship, but we also need that conflict zone if we are going to grow.
Indeed. So with that said, we want to say thank you all so very, very much for trusting us, for engaging, for placing your stories on the chat, for being open to this conversation. As educators, we truly show up with this concept of peace and love, especially as educators that know exactly what we signed up for in this particular spaces where you have folks who come from an array of perspectives. And we ask ourselves then, what truly then is our role, whether as faculty or as, a pedagogue, practitioners in this particular space. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and pass the mic back to Dr. Irungo. But please know that I will be sharing this. We will be sharing this with Encore, and Encore then can share it out with all the participants. To all, Thank you so very much. Gratitude.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benitez and Dr. Campbell. We have about 9 minutes, and there are lots of questions in the chat. So I'll give you that back for about 8 minutes if you can address either 1 or 2 questions in the chat, or you want to ask somebody to ask their question, they can unmute themselves.
Yes, please. I'm good either way. So if you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and ask it.
Michael, I did see a few questions throughout wanting more detail about bias reporting and how exactly to negotiate that, deal with that on campuses.
Yeah, you know, a series of institutions have bias reporting mechanisms. Some of them stop there, and it becomes part of, like, for example, student conduct process, or is tied to a faculty and staff process. But all other institutions do a really good job, I believe, tying educational components of that. I know that when I used that process and contributed and strengthened that process at my former institution, that the educational piece, how do you use and utilize the data? How do you make it easier for people to report? How do you look at data not only in the aggregate, but eventually in the disaggregate? What narrative does that say about your particular campus culture? And how do you tailor educational and programmatic proactive opportunities for people to have those conversations, especially around civility, or especially around things like academic freedom and freedom of speech, or bearing the brunt of injustice that accounts for the culture, the politics, the history behind all that. And I'll speak from a place of my particular and current work that I thought was very effective, because it at least provided an opportunity. And a lot of people sometimes, they don't want to, let's say, necessarily proceed further. They just want to report it, but it allows the institution to gather those narratives and the data to be able to proactively address it educationally and programmatically.
I have a question for both of you that probably for us here in Oklahoma is something that we've been really grappling with. So there is a bill 1775, and we can talk about issues of race or inequities in a certain way. And I know that our faculty have been wondering about where is the freedom of speech, where is academic freedom, what is that thin line, and how should faculty protect themselves from, even being cited for this in their classrooms. And most of them, in the history faculty department and others, where some of these are really historical facts. Can you briefly address that?
Yes. Michael, did you want to take this one? Or?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, that's a great question, Jane. The thing about these issues is that we also, right, this goes back to the public versus private. When we choose to share our thoughts, opinions, and I hope we're doing that in higher ed and academia, we also have to own what comes with it. There's an ownership that comes with that. That faculty and or staff, especially when they're open and that's quoted or they're put out there, and being able to, in some ways embrace that tension, not to be at peace with that tension and what it is, but the reality that the way that they show up matters in significant ways. And this is not necessarily to silence, but it also goes back to the way we set the tone, right? Share what you feel comfortable sharing. Right. And so that takes, I think, a process throughout the way that we exist in the spaces in particular, Jane, because we can control, if I'm teaching a class and I'm teaching it from a certain perspective, and I do my best to provide all the different perspectives, I'm likely going to lean on that, on certain aspects of that, but I'm also going to look at what's factual. I'm also going to look at the interpretation of data, not as alternative facts. And it's like for anyone in science here, I don't exactly go to a scientist and say, let me give you my perspective on the molecule. This is what a molecule is to me, right? So there's one perspectives that are, offered by way of criticality or not, hopefully with criticality. And then there are perspectives that are truly grounded in factual evidence around the way people experience their lives as a result of existing in dominant spaces.
Yes. And I would say it would be great if we had the opportunity to use it as a learning experience and advise people to go back and read John Stuart Mill, read Mill, and recognize that he was foundational in establishing our free speech principle and the idea that the truth comes through the clash of arguments. So it's important to be able to share these kinds of ideas and arguments, and then also to highlight other Supreme Court cases that really framed speech within school systems, and whether it was Tinker and Demise, Hazelwood, we have others that really said basically that as long as speech does not disrupt the learning environment, then it's okay. And again, there's an expectation that educators in our pedagogy that we would support what we say with evidence, and that we would require others to support what they say with evidence.
So Dr. Campbell, you are the president of the Faculty Senate. So you are telling us stand in your truth and do not be afraid to speak that truth as long as it's supported by data and facts. Is that your stand?
Yes, but we could still be afraid. I mean, I just want to recognize that some
That's right.
situations we could still be nervous about expressing our truth because we will be challenged. Some of us will get death threats, unfortunately. I mean, that's just the reality of where we are in our culture today, and I want to recognize that.
So how do you protect faculty from that? Because I feel like faculty feel vulnerable in those situations.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And I think that comes from an administrative level in institutions. Of course, it comes from the ground up as well, but I would rely on senior administrators and to set the tone, and the Dean of Students office and people like Michael to be able to set, and I think we have our general counsel on the call too, David Fine. So senior leaders to be able to really just set that tone. But it's not.
Jane, I just want to add real quickly. No, Jane, what you bring up, I think, is the conundrum of the issues in contemporary society, especially educational spaces, because institutions, depending on what they're private or public, also have to lean so much. And I think the state that they're a part in also dictates and informs what that looks like, right? For example, it just really, really matters how an institution is anchored in a state. So we create the policies to be able to provide that protection. But even as faculty and or practitioners engage in some of that conversation and dialogue, and some of it could be pretty threatening to your point. If they don't rise to that threshold of a hate crime, there's really not much institutions can do to address it. But we do our best to address the educational understandings around the bias and how to ask and show up morally and responsibly to spaces once we start to understand how inequitable the brunt of injustice is by way of people's intersectionalities and identities. And I hear it here from a couple questions around minoritized students being tired of the conversations. Indeed, I hear that, and yet as educators, it's part of our continuing responsibility, right? Students show up and they spend 4 to 6 years with us, hopefully just that, unless they're going into grad school. But it's also to say that this is part of the work that is an education in a society that has such differing point of views, many of which are certainly hurtful and threatening. And then, by way of changing and or harm to others, unless, again, it rises to that level of physical harm, feeling threatened, or a danger to one's property or a property, it's really difficult to remove people from those climates and environments. It's really the nexus of this tension and why it's even ever so more important to engage it and take it on.
Well, thank you so very much. Unfortunately, we have ran out of time, but this is really an ongoing conversation. So my hope is that we all continue to engage in our institutions, across groups, across teams. If you have any questions for Dr. Benitez and Dr. Campbell, you can always reach out to us. We can make sure that you get in touch with them, or you can contact them directly. This workshop, the recording will be posted in about 5 days. If you want the slides, please email ncorwebinars@ou.edu, and we can provide those to you. But I want to take a moment and thank Michael and Katia so very much. This was actually a session at NCOR 2021 with a virtual conference. And for me, it was so impactful that I requested them to come back. So that is going to be a free and open session so that we reach more people. So I want to thank you both very, very much. And I hope that folks will invite you to their institutions to continue the conversation. Please drop a thank you. And I also want to thank all of you who have joined us today. I know it was quite early on the West Coast, but thank you for joining us on this off schedule workshop. Our next workshop is next week, so visit our website and you can see more of what we'll provide. I also want to remind everyone that call for proposals for NCOR 2022 is open, it's out. We shall be hosting you in person in Portland, Oregon, and we hope to see you all there. We shall also do a virtual conference fall of 2022, so the conversation continues. So thank you all so very much. We appreciate you for coming and for being part of our NCOR family. So University of Oklahoma in Norman, peacing out.